The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a mixture that carried the weight of countless verdicts and lives altered forever. On this unusually warm morning in a small U.S. city, the trial that had gripped the community was entering its most crucial stage. People had lined up outside before dawn, eager to claim a spot inside the gallery. By the time the bailiff opened the heavy oak doors, the benches were quickly filled with reporters, townsfolk, and curious onlookers. The air buzzed with whispers, speculation, and the scratch of pens on notepads. At the center of it all sat a little girl just 3 years old. Her name was withheld from the public to protect her, so everyone simply referred to her as the child. She sat nestled against her mother's side in the second row, holding on to a stuffed rabbit with one ear nearly chewed away. Her small fingers traced the toy's seams nervously, her wide brown eyes darting across the unfamiliar room. Her mother's lips trembled as she tried to soothe her daughter, whispering words of reassurance that even she didn't fully believe. The trial had dragged on for weeks, with attorneys battling over evidence, credibility, and timelines. The defense had been relentless in claiming the child was too young to understand what she had witnessed, that her words could not be trusted, and that her memory was fragile at best. The prosecution countered with physical evidence and testimony from experts, but the case remained precariously balanced. Everyone in the room knew that. Then, in an unexpected move, the prosecutor rose from his chair. He was a tall man with graying hair and a calm, measured tone that carried authority without needing to shout. Adjusting his tie, he walked toward the bench and spoke in a voice that cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Your Honor," he said, "the witness is ready." At first, it seemed like a routine statement. The jurors glanced toward the door, expecting another police officer, a medical expert, maybe even a neighbor. But when the prosecutor turned and gestured toward the little girl in the gallery, a collective gasp rippled through the room. The mother froze, clutching her daughter closer. The defense attorney shot to his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor." "Absolutely not. This child is 3 years old. She cannot be sworn in, cannot comprehend truth from falsehood, and certainly cannot withstand the pressure of questioning in open court." His voice shook, not just from indignation, but from something else: fear. He knew that if the jury heard directly from the child, his carefully built defense could collapse in an instant. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and years of experience, tapped his gavel for silence. "Mr. Wallace," he addressed the prosecutor, "this is highly unusual. You are suggesting that a toddler take the stand? Explain yourself." The prosecutor nodded. "Your Honor, I understand the concern, but the child does not need to be sworn in like an adult witness. She will not be subjected to harsh cross-examination. She communicates in her own way, and with the court's permission, I would like her to do so with the assistance of someone she trusts." The judge narrowed his eyes. "And who would that be?" A moment later, the sound of claws clicking against the marble floor turned every head. A large German shepherd, his coat sleek and his posture disciplined, walked into the room led by a uniformed handler. His name was Rex, a police dog with years of service in both protection and comfort roles. Many in the courtroom recognized him. He had been stationed in schools, worked at community events, and often comforted victims during interviews. When the little girl saw Rex, her face changed instantly. Her tense expression softened into relief as she wriggled free from her mother's arms. Clutching her stuffed rabbit, she hurried across the aisle, her tiny shoes making hollow clicks on the polished floor. She dropped the toy halfway, too eager to reach Rex, and wrapped her arms around his neck. The big dog didn't flinch. He simply sat, steady and calm, as though he knew exactly why he was there. A hushed murmur spread through the gallery. Even the jurors, who had been instructed to keep their emotions guarded, couldn't help but soften at the sight. One woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue, The defense lawyer shook his head vigorously. This is absurd. A child whispering to a dog cannot be considered testimony. The prosecutor raised his hand, silencing the commotion. Ladies and gentlemen, this child has endured what no one her age should ever face. She does not trust adults, she barely speaks to them. But with Rex, she has found a voice. We are not asking for cross-examination. We are asking that you listen. Not to me, not to her mother, but to her. The judge leaned back, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. His eyes traveled from the child hugging Rex to the restless jury, and then to the defendant seated at the table. The man on trial had gone pale, his once confident smirk replaced with tight, nervous lips. The judge took a long breath. This court is bound by the pursuit of truth, he said finally. The child may approach the stand, but she may speak only in her own words. The room went still. The bailiff guided the girl forward, though she hardly needed encouragement with Rex walking faithfully by her side. She climbed awkwardly onto the witness chair, her legs too short to dangle properly. Rex settled beside her, his head level with her small hands. She clutched his fur tightly, burying her cheek against him. The prosecutor crouched beside her, his voice gentle. Sweetheart, do you remember why you're here? The little girl nodded. Double quotes. Do you want to tell Rex what you saw? Her voice was so soft the microphones barely caught it. She leaned close to Rex's ear, her lips moving. The entire room strained to hear, but at first the words were muffled, almost inaudible. Then, clear enough for everyone, 2 words slipped out. Bad man. The silence that followed was deafening. Dozens of heads turned instantly toward the defendant. The man's eyes widened, his jaw tightening. The jurors leaned forward, their attention locked on the tiny finger that suddenly lifted from the child's side. She pointed, slowly but firmly, toward the man sitting at the defense table. The defense attorney shot up again, his voice cracking. Objection. This is prejudice. This is nonsense. But no one was listening. The image had already burned itself into everyone's mind. A 3-year-old, clutching a loyal dog, whispering the simplest truth she knew. The judge's gavel finally struck. Order in the court. But even as the noise settled, the weight of those 2 words, bad man, hung in the air like thunder waiting to break. The echoes of the little girl's words still lingered in the air, like a haunting melody, 2 syllables that carried more weight than hours of legal arguments. Bad man. The gallery had gasped. Jurors had leaned forward in disbelief, and the defendant's confidence had cracked like thin ice under pressure. But the trial wasn't over. Far from it. Objection. The defense attorney's voice rang sharply, dragging everyone's attention back to the tension at hand. He was younger than the prosecutor, ambitious, and until that moment had thrived on undermining witnesses with quick wit and precise language. But now his voice trembled. Your Honor, this is unacceptable. The child cannot be considered competent to testify. She doesn't understand the nature of truth or lies. This entire display, with the dog, is nothing but theatrics meant to sway the jury. He straightened his tie and added, the defense moves to strike this so-called testimony from the record. The judge's gavel came down once, not in anger, but as a reminder of authority. Mr. Daniels, the court understands your concern. However, what we just witnessed was not coached testimony. It was spontaneous, and it directly implicated the defendant. This court will not simply ignore that. Daniels pressed on. With respect, Your Honor, this is dangerous precedent. What's next? Letting a parrot testify if it mimics a phrase? A few chuckles rippled in the gallery, but they quickly died under the judge's stern glare. The prosecutor stood slowly, projecting calm, though his eyes gleamed with determination. Your Honor, this is not about precedent. It is about truth. We are not asking the jury to weigh her testimony as they would in adults. We are asking, them to consider her words in the context of all evidence presented. This child speaks when she feels safe, and Rex provides that safety. It is not a trick, it is her only voice. The jurors shifted in their seats, their faces solemn. The judge leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench. His silver brows knitted together as he studied the girl still seated in the witness chair, her small hand wrapped tightly in Rex's fur. She wasn't aware of the arguments raging around her. She hummed softly, rocking slightly, her stuffed rabbit lying forgotten on the floor. Finally, the judge sighed. The objection is overruled. The child's words will remain in the record. Proceed carefully, counselor. The defense attorney sank into his chair, his jaw clenched. The defendant beside him whispered something heated, his knuckles white as he gripped the table edge. The prosecutor knelt again by the child, his voice gentle. Sweetheart, do you want to tell Rex anything else? The girl blinked, looked at Rex, then shook her head. Her small body shifted, pressing closer into the German shepherd's side. The prosecutor nodded. That's all right. Thank you. He turned to the judge. The child has said what she needed to. The prosecution rests for now. The judge gestured. Very well. Bailiff, please escort the child back to her mother. But the little girl resisted, clinging to Rex's collar. The gallery's collective heart squeezed at the sight. The handler approached, kneeling to stroke the dog's neck. Rex will sit with you and Mommy, he whispered to the child. Her eyes lit up, and she nodded eagerly. Only then did she allow herself to be led back, Rex padding faithfully beside her. The moment she was seated safely in her mother's lap, the room seemed to exhale. A tension that had built to unbearable heights eased, though no one could shake the echo of her words. The judge looked toward the defense table. Mr. Daniels, the floor is yours. Daniels rose reluctantly. His mind raced. The jury had just witnessed something raw, something impossible to erase. Logic and legal arguments might not undo it. He needed strategy. He needed doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, walking slowly before the jury box. What you just saw was heartbreaking. A child, an innocent, frightened child, placed into circumstances no child should ever endure. But let me be clear. What you saw was not testimony. It was an emotional reaction. Children at that age confuse dreams with reality. They parrot words they hear. They misinterpret faces. This is psychology, not truth. He paused, letting his words sink in. If we convict a man on the whispers of a toddler, we undermine the very foundation of justice. Our system requires evidence, facts, not the emotional pull of a scene orchestrated with a dog to comfort her. Some jurors nodded faintly, but others frowned. The image of the child, pointing, was hard to shake. The prosecutor objected to the characterization, but the judge allowed Daniels to continue. Daniels straightened his notes. Let's remember, this child never said the defendant's name. She never gave a description. She uttered two vague words. Bad man. That could mean anyone. That could mean a shadow in a dream. His voice grew sharper. The prosecution wants you to feel, not think. But you must think. You must weigh evidence, not emotions. And the evidence, I remind you, is thin. He returned to his seat, satisfied he had at least planted a seed of doubt. But the prosecution wasn't finished. Rising again, Wallace addressed the jury directly. The defense would have you believe what you saw was nothing. But tell me, did that look like nothing to you? Did it look rehearsed? Did it look manipulated? That child spoke only when Rex was present. She trusted him with the truth she could not share with adults. She said, "Bad man," and she pointed. Not vaguely, not randomly, directly at the defendant. He turned sharply toward the accused. That is not coincidence. That is not a dream. That is recognition. The defendant shifted, avoiding the prosecutor's gaze. Wallace's tone softened as he continued. This case is not built on her words alone. We have physical evidence. We have timelines. We have corroboration. But what you saw today was the purest truth from the eyes of a child who has no agenda, no reason to lie. You cannot dismiss it. You cannot forget it. Silence filled the room once more. The judge called for a recess. The jurors filed out, their faces unreadable, yet the tension in their shoulders betrayed the weight of what they had just witnessed. In the gallery, whispers erupted immediately. Reporters scribbled furiously, already drafting headlines that would electrify the evening news. 3-year-old stuns courtroom. Police dog unlocks testimony. 2 words that could convict. The mother held her daughter tightly, tears streaking down her cheeks. She stroked the child's hair, whispering, "You did so good, baby. You did so good." The girl smiled faintly, not understanding the significance, only happy that Rex sat beside her, his tail thumping gently on the floor. At the defense table, Daniels leaned close to his client. "We can recover," he muttered, though his eyes betrayed doubt. "We just have to discredit her. Tomorrow, I'll bring in an expert on child psychology. They'll testify kids that young mix fantasy with reality. We'll poke holes." The defendant didn't respond. His stare remained fixed on the little girl across the room, his jaw clenched tight. And though the trial would continue, though evidence and testimony would still flow, everyone in that room knew something had changed. The jury had seen innocence point at guilt, and no matter how many words the lawyer spoke, those 2 bad men would echo louder. The words still echoed in the minds of everyone present. Bad man. 2 words, whispered so softly they barely reached the microphones, yet they carried more force than any cross-examination or forensic report ever could. The gallery had gasped, the defendant had stiffened, and the jury, 12 strangers tasked with carrying justice, leaned forward as though drawn by invisible strings. The little girl's hand had lifted, her tiny finger trembling but steady, pointing directly at the man seated at the defense table. For a moment, it felt as though time had frozen. Even the judge, a man with decades of experience, sat motionless, studying her with an expression that bordered on disbelief. The defense attorney was the first to break the spell. He shot up from his chair, voice rising above the heavy silence. "Objection, Your Honor." His words tumbled out quickly, betraying the panic he fought to suppress. "This is outrageous. She is 3 years old. She doesn't understand the implications of what she's saying. Children point at strangers in supermarkets and call them monsters. This cannot stand." But the judge didn't interrupt the child. His gaze remained locked on her, as if weighing not the legality, but the sincerity of what had just happened. The prosecutor stayed quiet too, resisting the temptation to speak, knowing silence gave the moment greater weight. The girl, unaware of the eruption her words had caused, leaned back into Rex's fur. Her tiny body shook, but not from stage fright, it was fear, the kind children feel when reminded of shadows in their closet. Rex, sensing her unease, nudged her gently, his calm presence grounding her. She hugged his neck tighter, whispering something no one else could hear. Finally, the judge spoke. His voice was steady, but softer than usual. "The objection is noted. Overruled." A collective gasp rose from the gallery. The defense attorney's face flushed red. He slammed his palm against the table. "Your Honor, you are allowing a toddler's imagination to taint this court. My client's constitutional rights are being trampled by baby talk." The judge's gavel cracked down sharply. "Enough, Mr. Daniels. Sit down." The defense lawyer swallowed his anger and obeyed, though his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his face twitched. The defendant leaned toward him, whispering furiously, but Daniels waved him off, still rattled by the turn of events. The prosecutor, sensing opportunity, rose to his feet. He didn't rush toward the girl or pepper her with questions. Instead, he approached slowly, crouching to her level, careful not to break the fragile trust she had with Rex. "Sweetheart," he said softly, his tone more like a father than a lawyer, "you did very well. Can you tell Rex anything else?" The girl's big brown eyes flicked to him briefly, then back to the dog. She buried her face in Rex's fur and shook her head. Her lips pressed against the shepherd's ear, whispering something only he could hear. Rex's ears twitched, his tail giving the faintest wag. The prosecutor smiled faintly. "That's okay. You've said what you needed to." He straightened and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the child has identified the defendant in her own way. We will not press her further." The judge nodded gravely. "Very well. Bailiff, escort the child back to her mother." But the child didn't move. She clung tighter to Rex, shaking her head, tears brimming in her eyes. The handler stepped forward, crouching beside Rex. "Hey, girl," he said gently. "Rex can sit with you and Mommy. He'll stay close." The child blinked, then slowly released her grip. She slid off the chair, one hand clutching Rex's collar as if it were a lifeline. Together, they walked back to the gallery, where her mother's arms reached out in relief. The mother's tears came freely now, soaking the girl's hair as she held her tightly. Rex lay down at their feet, a silent guardian. The courtroom, still tense, seemed to exhale collectively. The prosecutor returned to his seat, his face calm but his heart pounding. He knew the defense would fight tooth and nail to discredit what just happened. But he also knew the jury had witnessed something unforgettable, something words alone could never erase. The judge turned toward Daniels. "The defense may proceed?" Daniels rose reluctantly. He smoothed his suit jacket, his mind racing. The girl's testimony, if it could be called that, was devastating. The jury had seen innocence point directly at guilt. He needed to shatter it, to plant doubt strong enough to overshadow what they had felt. He approached the jury box, his expression solemn. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to consider carefully what you just saw." A child, no older than 3, whispered 2 words. "Bad man." Now, I don't question that she believes what she said. But believing and knowing are not the same thing. Children of that age confuse dreams with reality. They mistake costumes for monsters, strangers for villains. They parrot phrases they've heard from adults. This is not evidence. This is emotion." He paused, scanning their faces. Some looked thoughtful, others skeptical. One juror bit his lip, clearly torn. Daniels pressed on. "Ask yourselves, would you convict a man, possibly condemn him to a lifetime behind bars, based on the whispers of a toddler? Would you risk sending an innocent man away on the fragile, confused words of a child who cannot even spell her own name?" He let the words hang in the air, then slowly returned to his seat. The prosecutor stood. "May I, Your Honor?" The judge gestured for him to proceed. Wallace walked to the jury, his expression firm. "The defense wants you to believe what you saw was meaningless. But did it look meaningless to you? Did it look rehearsed? That child didn't glance at me, or her mother, or anyone else for approval. She didn't look for cues. She spoke to Rex, the one soul she trusts, and pointed without hesitation. That was not confusion. That was recognition." He pointed toward the defendant. Recognition of the man who shattered her world. The jurors shifted again, and the defense attorney's lips tightened into a thin line. The judge, sensing the rising tension, called for a recess. The jurors filed out, their faces unreadable but heavy with thought. The gallery erupted into whispers, reporters scribbling furiously, their headlines practically writing themselves. Child points at defendant. Police dog unlocks testimony. Toddler's 2 words stunned courtroom. The defendant leaned into Daniels, his whisper harsh. "You promised me this kid couldn't talk." Daniels hissed back. I said she wouldn't testify. What she did wasn't supposed to be possible. A man's fists clenched, his eyes locked on the little girl across the room. She sat on her mother's lap again, Rex at her side, stroking his fur with tiny, trembling hands. Her face was calmer now, though her eyes carried the shadow of everything she had seen. The prosecutor watched quietly from his seat, his thoughts circling. He had evidence, yes. Witnesses, timelines, forensics. But what had just happened was beyond evidence. It was truth distilled into its purest form. Innocence pointing at guilt. And he knew, no matter how eloquent the defense became, the jury would never forget it. The case was far from over. But the scales had shifted, and all it took was 2 words from the smallest voice in the room. The recess bell echoed, and the bailiff's voice cut through the air. All rise. The jurors filed out in quiet procession, their faces carefully composed, but their eyes betraying what decorum couldn't hide: confusion, sympathy, and the heavy weight of what they'd just witnessed. Reporters outside the courthouse had been restless for days, but as the doors opened, their pens and cameras became weapons. Headlines had already begun taking shape. Toddler points at accused. Whisper stuns courtroom. The press smelled blood, and the scent carried far beyond the courthouse steps. Inside, the atmosphere was charged, as if electricity hummed through the wood-paneled walls. Spectators buzzed, ignoring the bailiff's repeated calls for order. On one side of the room, the defendant sat with his lawyer, both men leaning into each other with urgency. On the other, the prosecutor stood alone, his gaze fixed on the little girl now cradled in her mother's arms. Rex stretched across their feet like a living shield. The mother kissed her daughter's temple, whispering assurances, but the child's eyes remained fixed on one figure, the defendant. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her tiny hand clung to Rex's fur, twisting and untwisting, grounding herself in the dog's steady warmth. The defense attorney, Daniels, rubbed his temples with both hands. He had prepared for cross-examining adult witnesses, for dismantling forensic timelines, for pointing out technicalities. But he hadn't prepared for the simple purity of a toddler's voice, cutting through the courtroom like a blade. He needed to shift the narrative, and fast. "We'll call a child psychologist," Daniels muttered to his client. "Someone who'll testify about memory formation at that age, about suggestibility, about how kids confuse stories with reality. If we can't discredit her, we'll discredit the very idea of toddler testimony." The defendant's jaw clenched. "Do whatever you have to. She's ruining everything." His voice was low, but his eyes flicked again toward the girl, sharp and full of venom. The prosecutor, Wallace, noticed. He didn't miss much. He scribbled a note to himself. Jury saw him glare at her. Highlight later: predator versus child. He tucked the paper into his file, knowing timing would be everything. When the jurors were gone, and the gallery buzz simmered into background noise, Wallace finally approached the mother and child. He crouched low, speaking gently. "She was very brave today," he said, his eyes on the little girl. "More than anyone could ask." The mother's voice cracked. "She shouldn't have to be brave. She should be in preschool, painting with her fingers, not." She stopped, her throat tightening. Wallace nodded. "You're right. But what she did may have tipped the scales toward justice. Sometimes truth comes from the smallest voices." The child didn't answer, just pressed her cheek to Rex's ear, as if whispering a secret. Rex wagged his tail faintly, his golden brown eyes calm, unfazed by the chaos of human emotion around him. Meanwhile, Daniels requested a brief private conference with the judge in chambers. He argued, almost pleaded, that the girl's words should be stricken from the record. This was not sworn testimony. This was an emotional outburst, unsolicited, unreliable, and prejudicial. The jury will never recover from it. It's poison to the fairness of this trial. Judge Whitmore listened patiently, fingers steepled under his chin. And yet, Counsel, you were present. You saw her. Do you honestly believe anyone instructed her to point at your client? Daniels faltered for just a moment, then rallied. Belief is irrelevant. The law is what matters. This borders on a mistrial. The judge's eyes narrowed. Be careful what you wish for, Mr. Daniels. A mistrial would mean a retrial. And do you think the public will forget what happened here? That girl's 2 words will echo through every headline and newscast. A second jury will walk in already carrying her testimony in their minds. Daniels swallowed his frustration. He knew the judge was right. Then at least allow me to call experts. Give me the chance to show how unreliable children that age are. The judge leaned back, thoughtful. You'll get your chance. But tread carefully. This court will not tolerate the badgering of a toddler, especially when already scarred. When Daniels left chambers, his face was grim. His strategy was set, but he knew the path ahead would be treacherous. The recess dragged on, though in truth it was only 20 minutes. For the mother and her daughter, it felt endless. Every whisper from the gallery, every sideways glance, every creak of the wooden benches seemed amplified. Rex remained unbothered, breathing slow and steady, his presence a balm in the storm. When the bailiff finally called, "All rise," and the jurors filed back in, the energy in the room had shifted. Their faces showed the struggle of ordinary citizens thrust into extraordinary responsibility. They weren't just weighing evidence now. They were carrying the image of a child's trembling hand pointing toward evil. The judge's gavel restored silence. Court is back in session. The prosecutor prepared to continue his case. But he knew this moment had already reshaped the trial. The girl's words weren't officially evidence in the strictest sense, but they had become part of the narrative, part of the story the jury would remember when they deliberated. Daniels, meanwhile, scribbled his first question for the psychologist he intended to call. He'd chip away at the reliability of memory, of toddler speech, of the entire fragile scaffold the prosecution had built. He would make the jurors question not just what they heard, but what they felt. But as he looked across the room, he caught sight of the girl again. She sat in her mother's lap, calmer now, Rex's head resting on her tiny legs. She wasn't scared anymore. Not of the courtroom, not of the people, not even of him. She had already spoken her truth. And truth, Daniels realized with a sinking feeling, was harder to bury than evidence. The judge cleared his throat. Counselors, we will resume with the prosecution's next witness. The record will reflect the child's remarks, but the jury is reminded to weigh them alongside all evidence presented, not as standalone proof. The words were judicial, measured, restrained. But everyone knew the jury had already been moved. In the gallery, whispers surged again, this time softer, more reverent. A few people even glanced at the girl with something akin to awe. She had become, in their eyes, more than a witness. She was a symbol of innocence, of truth, of courage that adults twice her size often failed to muster. The defendant shifted in his seat, his face dark. He knew it too. His carefully constructed facade was cracking. Piece by piece, under the weight of the child's voice and a dog's silent loyalty. And though the trial was far from over, one thing had become clear to everyone in that courtroom. The smallest witness had just become the most powerful. The courtroom was thick with tension as proceedings resumed. The judge's gavel had barely echoed through the chamber when Daniels, the defense attorney, rose to call his first witness, Dr. Evelyn Carter, a child psychologist with over 20 years of experience in developmental behavior. Her presence was formidable, her notes meticulously organized, and her demeanor calm, exactly what Daniels needed to counterbalance the extraordinary scene from earlier. Double quotes Dr. Carter. Daniels began, gesturing toward her. Could you explain to the court the cognitive abilities of a 3-year-old child and how they may impact memory and perception? Dr. Carter adjusted her glasses. Certainly, she said. At the age of 3, children's brains are rapidly developing, but their memory and perception are highly impressionable. They often confuse dreams and imagination with reality. They repeat phrases they've overheard from adults or media. Emotional responses can dominate cognitive processing, which means children may react to fear or stress rather than fact. The defense nodded approvingly. Daniels turned to the jury. So, jurors, it's not unusual for a child to misidentify people or exaggerate events. This is not testimony that can stand alone. A few jurors nodded subtly, though the tension in the room hadn't fully dissipated. The memory of the girl's trembling finger and the words "bad man" still lingered vividly in their minds. Wallace, the prosecutor, rose, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, may I cross-examine? The judge inclined his head. Proceed. Wallace stepped forward, his voice measured but firm. Dr. Carter, thank you for your insight. You mentioned that children can confuse dreams with reality. Are there circumstances where a child's reaction is instinctively accurate, even without verbal reasoning? Dr. Carter's eyes flicked toward the prosecutor. Yes, children can express recognition or fear instinctively, especially when triggered by familiar danger cues. Their reactions may precede conscious thought. It's not common, but it happens. Wallace leaned slightly closer to the jury. So, despite her age, it is entirely possible that the child accurately identified the person who framed her, correct? Dr. Carter nodded. It is possible. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Daniels fidgeted, sensing that the ground beneath his argument was suddenly less stable. Wallace continued, his tone softening, almost conversational. And if a child points, repeatedly and without prompting, at a specific individual while in a safe environment, does that carry weight in terms of instinctual recognition? Yes, Dr. Carter replied cautiously. It can. Particularly if the child trusts no other adults and communicates through a known companion or tool, a dog, for instance, as a stabilizing presence. The words hit the jury like a splash of cold water. They remembered the little girl, her small body pressed into Rex, whispering and pointing. Their initial doubts mingled with new understanding. This might not be mere imagination. Daniels rose quickly, trying to regain control. Dr. Carter, you are suggesting it is possible that a child could be correct, but you cannot confirm it. Correct? Yes, that is accurate, Dr. Carter said, her tone neutral. Exactly, Daniels pressed. Possible does not equal certainty. We cannot convict a man on possibility. That is the very foundation of reasonable doubt. The jurors shifted again, some nodding slightly, others still absorbed in the child's earlier actions. Wallace, realizing he needed to humanize the science, approached carefully. Dr. Carter, would it surprise you to know that the child pointed directly at the defendant while in a controlled, safe environment with no adults influencing her? That this identification was consistent with all other evidence collected independently? Dr. Carter's eyebrows rose slightly. If true, it suggests that her instinctive reaction may align with factual events. Wallace turned slightly, addressing the jury with intensity. And that is why we are here. Because in addition to the physical evidence, the timeline, and the forensic reports, we witnessed instinctive recognition. We witnessed a child brave enough to point, not randomly, not confusedly, but deliberately and with clarity at the person who hurt her. The defense attorney rose again, visibly frustrated. Your Honor, the prosecution is attempting to convert instinct and emotion into evidence. This is dangerous, misleading, and prejudicial. The judge's eyes narrowed. Mr. Daniels, you may object, but you must also acknowledge that the court has allowed testimony in this context. Overzealous arguments will not be tolerated. Daniels sat down, muttering under his breath. He knew the prosecution was carefully walking the line, turning what he had hoped would be a weak link into something tangible and compelling. The gallery remained silent. Every listener understood the stakes. Outside, reporters were poised to transmit every word live. Inside, jurors were weighing science, instinct, and human truth, blurring lines that Daniels wanted starkly defined. Wallace returned to his seat briefly, but leaned forward again. "Dr. Carter, one last question. Is it common for children to accurately identify perpetrators through nonverbal cues when they are too scared or traumatized to speak freely?" "Yes, it can occur," she admitted, "especially when the child has a trusted intermediary, such as a trained animal companion who provides comfort and security. The child's fear is managed, and they can express recognition instinctively." The courtroom was nearly silent. A few jurors exchanged glances. Some whispered softly to each other. The seed of doubt had shifted, no longer solely in favor of the defense. The prosecutor finally sat, letting the weight of Dr. Carter's words settle over the room. He didn't need to embellish. The scene itself, the child, Rex, the pointing finger, did the work. Daniels, sensing that his opportunity had slipped, attempted one last maneuver. "Dr. Carter, you admit the child's testimony is circumstantial, correct?" "Yes," she said cautiously. "Exactly. Circumstantial, not direct, not reliable. We cannot convict on this alone." The jurors listened, but the image of that small, resolute finger was burned into their memories. The girl's body language, the trust she placed in Rex, and the calm certainty with which she indicated the defendant all combined with Dr. Carter's testimony to create a difficult, almost unshakable impression. The judge finally called for a short break. The courtroom emptied slightly, jurors murmuring quietly among themselves. The mother adjusted her daughter on her lap, gently stroking her hair. "You're doing so well," she whispered. The little girl leaned into Rex, who nudged her gently, calm and steady, as though he understood the enormity of what had just occurred. Wallace glanced at the defense, noting the subtle signs of desperation. Daniel's clenched jaw, the defendant's pale face, the tension in every muscle. Yet he also knew the trial was far from over. Evidence, witnesses, and cross-examinations still remained. But one thing was undeniable. The innocence of a 3-year-old had left an indelible mark on everyone in that courtroom. As the recess concluded and proceedings resumed, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Adults could argue, analyze, and dissect, but the instinctive truth from a child who had experienced terror firsthand had carved itself into memory, influencing judgment in ways evidence alone could not. Even the defendant, seated rigidly, seemed to understand this. His smirk had vanished, replaced by anxiety. His gaze flicked repeatedly toward the little girl, now curled against her mother with Rex at her side. Wallace prepared for the next witness, quietly confident that the jury would never forget the scene. Innocence pointing directly at guilt, courage speaking without words, and instinct conveying what logic struggled to prove. The courtroom had settled into a tense, almost suffocating silence. After recess, everyone returned to their seats, but the atmosphere had changed. The jurors were quieter than usual, their eyes betraying a mix of curiosity, unease, and lingering impressions from the child's testimony. Even seasoned reporters felt a strange gravity in the air. The events of the morning, the small girl, her whispered words, and the unwavering trust in Rex had imprinted on every observer. Daniels, the defense attorney, rose again. His mind raced. He had seen how Dr. Carter's testimony had weakened his arguments. The jury, despite his attempts to emphasize the unreliability of a 3-year-old, had already internalized the image of the child, pointing at the defendant, her expression grave and unflinching. Now he needed a strategy that would allow him to regain some control. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady despite the storm inside him, "we will call a second expert witness. This witness will provide further insight into the cognitive limitations of children this age. especially in high-stress situations. The judge nodded, tapping his gavel lightly. Proceed, Mr. Daniels, but remember, this court will not allow harassment of any child witness. Keep your examination professional and concise. The second expert, Dr. Samuel Hughes, was a specialist in developmental trauma. He stepped forward, briefcase in hand, his expression serious but composed. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, he began, I have studied hundreds of children who have experienced trauma. Their memories are often fragmented, distorted, or influenced by adults, media, or even internal fears. Daniels leaned forward. Dr. Hughes, can you explain how a child's fear can affect the accuracy of their recollections? Dr. Hughes nodded. Certainly. Fear can heighten emotional responses, but it does not always improve accuracy. Children may fixate on certain details, faces, gestures, or objects, while misremembering or exaggerating others. They may act instinctively, but instinct does not always equal fact. Several jurors nodded subtly, absorbing the technical nuance. Daniels pressed on. So, it is entirely possible, Dr. Hughes, that what the child said or did could be influenced by fear or confusion rather than an accurate recollection of events. Yes, Dr. Hughes replied. Absolutely. This is common in children under 5. They process experiences emotionally, and their communication often reflects instinct and imagination, rather than a deliberate statement of fact. Daniels allowed himself a small, controlled nod. He had to appear confident, to anchor the jury in reason and evidence rather than emotion. Thank you, Dr. Hughes. No further questions. The prosecutor, Wallace, rose slowly. His eyes swept the courtroom before settling on the child. She was seated quietly with her mother, her hands resting on Rex's back. Her large brown eyes were alert, though calm, absorbing the proceedings without understanding the legal complexities swirling around her. Wallace approached. Dr. Hughes. Doctor, you mentioned that fear can distort memory. Are there circumstances in which instinctive recognition can bypass cognitive distortion? Dr. Hughes glanced at the child before answering. Yes, it can happen, particularly when the child is in a safe environment, and when the response is nonverbal, such as pointing, body language, or subtle gestures. The presence of a trusted companion, such as an animal, can reduce stress enough for the child to indicate recognition accurately. The jurors stirred slightly, some exchanging glances. The weight of instinct versus cognitive distortion was becoming undeniable. Wallace continued, careful not to appear combative. And in this particular case, the child was not only calm, but appeared confident in her actions when she indicated the defendant, correct? Yes, Dr. Hughes admitted, his voice neutral. She displayed no hesitation. That behavior aligns with instances of instinctive recognition. Wallace leaned forward slightly, emphasizing his point. So, despite her age, and despite the common limitations of child memory, her pointing directly at the defendant carries meaningful weight. Dr. Hughes hesitated, then nodded. It carries weight, yes, in the context of instinctive recognition. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's jaw tightened. The defense had tried to discredit the child's testimony with science, but the expert's own words now complicated their case. They acknowledged that instinctive behavior, particularly in a safe environment and with the aid of a trusted companion, could be accurate. Wallace returned to his seat, allowing the implications to settle. The jury had witnessed the child's instinctive pointing, her whispered words, and now heard confirmation from 2 experts that such behavior could reliably indicate recognition. The weight of this simple truth, spoken and acted out by a 3-year-old, was almost palpable. Daniels rose once more, desperation creeping into his voice. Your Honor, may I redirect briefly? The judge nodded. Proceed, but carefully. Daniels approached Dr. Hughes. Doctor, you are admitting that such occurrences are rare, correct? Yes, Dr. Hughes replied. They are not common. Most children do not reliably indicate recognition in these ways at that age. Exactly, Daniels said, his voice gaining confidence. Rare, not typical. And therefore, the likelihood that this child's actions accurately reflect reality is still highly questionable. This is a single, extraordinary instance. Extraordinary is not evidence. The jurors considered this carefully, their expressions conflicted. Extraordinary indeed, but in this courtroom, extraordinary could not be ignored. After a brief pause, the judge called for a short recess. The gallery murmured quietly. Outside, the media prepared their updates, their cameras poised for live coverage. The courthouse steps were crowded, the hum of public attention almost deafening. Inside, the child rested her head on Rex's shoulder, her small fingers gently stroking his fur. Her mother whispered softly, "You're so brave." The girl smiled faintly, not fully grasping the magnitude of her role, only understanding that Rex's presence kept her safe. The prosecutor observed quietly, taking mental notes. The child's instinctive recognition had already left an indelible mark on the jurors. While Daniels attempted to plant seeds of doubt, the evidence of pure human instinct, her pointing, her whispered words, her calm behavior in Rex's presence, was a force that no textbook or lecture could erase. As the recess ended, the court reconvened. The tension was electric. Every word spoken, every gesture observed, seemed amplified in significance. The trial had reached a critical juncture. Evidence, expert testimony, instinct, and innocence collided, leaving the jury to navigate a path through both reason and emotion. Wallace prepared for the next witness, confident that the jury would continue to weigh not just facts, but the undeniable impression of a child who had seen fear, named it, and indicated its source. Daniels, meanwhile, fought to maintain the fragile scaffolding of doubt he had built, knowing that every moment the child's presence was felt, his chances of success diminished. And through it all, Rex remained a silent guardian, tethered to the small witness, who had, without words, begun to shift the course of justice. In this room, where law and human experience intersected, the smallest voice had already spoken louder than any argument. And the trial, though far from over, had been forever altered. The courtroom hummed with anticipation. Every seat was filled. Every eye was focused. Every mind racing with recollections of the child's testimony and the extraordinary sequence of events that had followed. The morning had been consumed by expert testimony, conflicting opinions, and the relentless tug-of-war between instinct and logic. Now, the trial approached the threshold of its final witnesses. Daniels, the defense attorney, rose once again, shoulders squared but tension evident in the tightening of his jaw. He knew he had to act decisively. The jurors had witnessed the little girl's calm, resolute pointing, and heard experts acknowledge that instinctive recognition, rare though it may be, was possible. That visual, coupled with her whispered words, "bad man," was seared into their memory. His previous strategies of highlighting uncertainty were slipping like sand through his fingers. "Your Honor," Daniels began, voice firm, "we will call one final witness to speak to the reliability of eyewitness accounts in children under 5, particularly under stress. This testimony will provide context for the jury, ensuring they are not swayed unduly by emotion or instinct." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Dr. Amanda Reed, a renowned psychologist specializing in early childhood cognition and trauma, stepped forward. She carried a calm authority and an air of objectivity that Daniels hoped would resonate. "Dr. Reed," Daniels asked, "can you describe the cognitive and emotional limitations of children in identifying individuals accurately?" Dr. Reed adjusted her notes. "Certainly. While children can display remarkable observational skills, they are highly susceptible to suggestion, anxiety, and the influence of trusted adults or peers. At age 3, They rarely have the capacity to recall complex sequences accurately. Their memory can be fragmented, and they may blend imagination with reality. Daniel's eyes met the jury. So, ladies and gentlemen, while the child may appear confident, her statements are not definitive. Confidence does not equal accuracy. The jurors listened intently, some nodding subtly. Daniels allowed himself a fleeting sense of control. He had presented a third expert, confirming the fragility of toddler recollection. But Wallace, the prosecutor, rose slowly. His calm demeanor masked the intensity of his focus. He walked deliberately toward Dr. Reed, carefully maintaining eye contact with the jury. "Dr. Reed," he began, voice steady, "you've discussed the general tendencies of children and the risks of suggestion. But are there instances where a child, under safe and controlled conditions, can instinctively indicate recognition of an individual who caused trauma?" Dr. Reed paused, choosing her words with precision. "Yes, there are documented cases where children respond nonverbally through pointing, gestures, or other instinctive actions when they feel safe and are unpressured. This is less common, but possible, particularly if the child has formed trust with a mediator or companion who provides comfort, such as a trained animal." Wallace allowed the words to resonate, then directed his gaze at the little girl. The child, seated on her mother's lap with Rex by her side, tilted her head slightly, eyes wide but calm, observing the adults around her. The instinctive confidence of her earlier actions was unmistakable. Dr. Reed continued, "In such cases, the child's nonverbal responses can be remarkably consistent with reality, even when verbal articulation is limited." The jurors shifted in their seats, some leaning forward. Their earlier doubts, planted by Daniel's testimony, now mingled with the undeniable image of the child, her finger extended, whispering only to Rex. The instinctive recognition she had displayed was no longer merely an isolated event. It was corroborated by expert testimony as within the realm of human possibility. Daniels rose again, his hands gripping his notes tightly. "Dr. Reed, while it is possible, it remains rare. It is not typical behavior. Therefore, it cannot be considered conclusive. The child's actions, while compelling emotionally, do not meet the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt." Wallace countered swiftly. "Possible, yes. Rare, yes. But when combined with all other evidence, the timelines, forensic analysis, witness accounts, and the child's unprompted, instinctive identification, it becomes part of a broader pattern that cannot be ignored." The jurors exchanged glances. The rational mind wrestled with the emotional imprint of the little girl's gesture. She had spoken no words beyond the two that would define the morning, yet her presence dominated the room. Her small hand had done more to shape perception than any elaborate testimony, and the expert's testimony only amplified that effect. The defendant shifted uneasily in his seat, glancing at the child. The smirk that had occasionally surfaced throughout the trial was gone, replaced by a taut anxiety. He seemed suddenly aware of the courtroom, not just as a place of law, but as a witness to his exposure. Every subtle motion, every silent acknowledgement of fear and recognition, magnified his vulnerability. The judge finally called for a brief recess, sensing the strain in the room. As the courtroom emptied slightly, whispers and quiet murmurs rippled through the gallery. Outside, reporters updated their live feeds, and social media buzzed with fragments of the unfolding drama. Toddler points at accused. Courtroom awaits verdict. Instinct and justice collide. Inside, the child remained calm, nestled in her mother's lap. Rex, ever vigilant, rested his head across her legs. The bond between them was tangible, a silent reassurance that steadied the girl through the overwhelming human intensity around her. Wallace took a moment to reflect, organizing his next moves. He had allowed the defense to present their experts, showing due diligence and allowing doubt. But he knew the trial had already been heavily influenced by what had occurred earlier. The child's instinctive recognition, her fearless pointing, and her calm reliance on Rex had created an emotional impression that would linger in the minds of the jurors long after the legal arguments ended. Daniels, meanwhile, conferred quietly with the defendant. His strategies had become narrower, more desperate. He knew the scales had shifted, yet he could not abandon the semblance of defense. He emphasized the rarity of instinctive recognition, the potential for memory distortion, and the influence of stress. But even as he spoke, he understood that the child's silent testimony, the unspoken truth conveyed through body language and trust in Rex, was beyond his reach. The courtroom reconvened after recess. Wallace rose once more, addressing the jury with measured intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen the child, small and courageous, indicate the person who caused her fear. Experts have acknowledged that her instinctive recognition is possible, and while rare, it aligns with the broader evidence in this case. You must weigh not only the words, but the courage, the instinct, and the undeniable clarity with which she expressed herself." The jurors listened, some with pens poised, others simply absorbing every nuance. Each moment of the child's presence seemed to reinforce the reality of her experience, a reality that the defendant could not escape. Daniels rose once last time. "The defense rests, Your Honor. We ask that you consider all testimony carefully and weigh the evidence objectively, not allowing emotion to override reason." The judge nodded, acknowledging the formal conclusion of the defense. He then instructed the jury to review all evidence carefully before deliberation. As the gavel fell, signaling a pause before closing arguments, the tension in the room remained palpable. The child rested quietly, Rex at her side, a small beacon of innocence amidst a complex web of legal and emotional threads. Her role, unintentional yet undeniable, had already transformed the courtroom. Everyone present understood it. The trial would never be about logic alone. It had become irrevocably about instinct, courage, and truth expressed in its purest, smallest form. And in the quiet corner of the room, the child, unaware of the impact she had made, stroked Rex's fur. 2 words had spoken volumes. And in the final hours of this trial, those words were destined to echo louder than any argument, testimony, or objection. The courtroom was tense, the air almost thick enough to touch. After days of testimony, expert witnesses, and heated arguments, the trial had reached its final act. Every observer, from seasoned attorneys to scribbling reporters, from jurors to gallery attendees, sensed that a verdict, monumental in its significance, was imminent. The events of the trial had become inseparable from the little girl and her quiet companion, Rex, who had been her anchor throughout. The jury filed in, their expressions guarded, but betraying subtle signs of the emotional toll. They had witnessed everything: the whispered words, the finger pointing, the calm instinctive recognition, and had heard the competing expert testimonies. Logic and instinct had clashed repeatedly in their minds. They carried the weight of truth, justice, and the memory of a child whose courage had become central to their deliberation. The judge called the courtroom to order. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a woman in her late 40s with a composed but weary expression, rose slowly. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." A hush fell. Even the defendant, usually bristling with confidence, seemed to shrink slightly in his seat. His attorney's hand rested tensely on the edge of the table, while Wallace straightened, anticipation quiet but keen. The foreperson handed a sheet of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge examined it briefly, then nodded. "Will the defendant please rise?" The accused stood, eyes darting nervously toward the child. She was seated quietly, stroking Rex's fur, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, but tethered to the outcome in ways words could not express. Judge cleared his throat. "On the charge of assault and endangerment of a minor, how does the jury find?" A long pause stretched through the courtroom, as if time itself were holding its breath. The foreperson lifted her voice, steady but resonant. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." A collective gasp swept the room. Some jurors exhaled audibly, a mixture of relief and finality. The defendant's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that would not come. Daniels, the defense attorney, slumped slightly in his chair, defeated but silent. Wallace allowed himself a restrained nod, feeling the culmination of the trial's delicate strategy, the careful balance of evidence, expert testimony, and the undeniable power of instinct and courage finally yield justice. The judge's gavel came down sharply, punctuating the moment. So ordered. In the gallery, murmurs broke into whispers, whispers into low chatter. Reporters began scribbling frantically, the phrase "toddler points at defendant" already forming the leading line for every article. But amidst the human noise, the little girl remained still, unaware of the monumental shift her small words and actions had inspired. Her mother leaned closer, whispering softly, "You did it, sweetheart. You helped make things right." The child looked up at her mother, then down at Rex, as if to say, "I only did what felt right." Rex responded with a gentle nudge, resting his nose against her tiny hand. The bond between child and dog had carried her through fear and chaos, and now seemed to symbolize the triumph of instinct, trust, and courage over wrongdoing. Outside the courtroom, news crews began reporting live. Cameras flashed, microphones hovered, and the story spread like wildfire. The headline was inevitable. 3-year-old points out attacker. Courtroom awed by courage. Social media exploded with comments praising the child's bravery, Rex's loyalty, and the profound impact of instinctive truth. Back inside, Wallace allowed himself a moment to reflect. This case had been far more than a legal battle. It had been a testament to the unexpected sources of truth. Evidence and logic alone might have swayed some minds, but the courage of a 3-year-old and the silent reassurance of her companion had carried a force beyond argument. The defendant was escorted from the courtroom, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His protests were muted against the authority of the gavel and the unanimity of the jury. His world had crumbled not through intimidation, not through aggression, but through the simplest, most profound acts of innocence and instinct, a child's recognition and a dog's unwavering presence. As the courtroom emptied, the mother gathered her daughter in her arms, holding her tightly. "You are so brave," she whispered again, tears streaming freely now. "You helped so many people today." The child leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. Rex nestled at their feet, tail wagging faintly. She didn't need to understand the intricacies of justice. She only knew that she had been safe. She had trusted her instincts, and her actions had mattered. The judge watched silently from his bench, reflecting on the unusual nature of the trial. He had presided over countless cases, yet rarely had he witnessed the profound impact of human instinct, trust, and courage manifest in such a tangible and undeniable way. A toddler and a police dog had reshaped the course of justice more effectively than months of legal argumentation ever could. In the halls of the courthouse, whispers turned to stories, and stories turned into lessons. People spoke of the small witness who had changed everything, of the power of instinct over pure evidence, and of the importance of courage, even in the smallest, most unexpected forms. Later, outside, reporters gathered the mother and child for interviews. Cameras flashed, microphones hovered, but the child remained composed, her trust in Rex guiding her calm demeanor. One reporter asked, "How did you know?" The mother gently interrupted, smiling. "She didn't know. She just did what she felt was right." And that was enough. Back in the courtroom, Wallace filed his final notes. Justice had been served, but the case would be remembered not only for its legal outcome, but for the remarkable influence of a child's courage, and a dog's loyalty. The impact of the trial would ripple far beyond the courthouse walls, serving as a reminder that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest weight. Daniels packed his briefcase in silence, the lesson bitter but unavoidable. In law as in life, logic can only go so far. Emotion, instinct, and truth, sometimes expressed without words, hold a power that cannot be quantified. Argued away or ignored, the little girl, unaware of the courtroom's historical significance, walked hand in hand with her mother, Rex by her side, leaving behind a trail of awe and inspiration. She had faced fear, spoken without words, and left an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed her courage. And so, the trial ended, not with the clamor of lawyers or the drama of evidence alone, but with the quiet heroism of a child and her dog, two beings who, through instinct, trust, and bravery, had changed everything. The courtroom would long remember the day when innocence spoke and justice listened.